Today we're going to talk about Greek and Roman philosophy. Here are the books I'm going to talk about, just so you guys know exactly what we're going to go into. The reason that I'm talking about this is because I just read Julius Caesar by Shakespeare, and I just want to talk about Rome. I want to talk about Caesar. I want to talk about Greece. I want to talk about these topics. But essentially, I think there's something to be said about Greek and Roman philosophy. I'm going to use the terms interchangeably because they really are kind of the same. You see, when Rome took over Greece, they kind of just accepted their culture. They kind of just adapted it to be their own, and it kind of took root and became it just became synonymous. So I'm just gonna use these words interchangeably. But the first thing we're gonna talk about is Cicero's selected works. I love Cicero. He's just so funny. Like legit, just one of the goofiest people you'll ever just come across because he was so intelligent and he knew it. And it's like there's very few people that are justifiably as arrogant as this guy. And there's just something to that. There's just something to a lovable asshole that you're just like, I get this guy. I get this guy. I get where he comes from. But this book is really not that much of philosophy. There is some philosophy towards the end of it, but a lot of it's history, a lot of it's background, a lot of it is Cicero's basically deconstruction of this guy at a trial. So I'm going to break into three different sections of what this book's about, essentially. So the first part is about Cicero's basically trial where this guy was stealing money from the taxpayers of Rome, and essentially Cicero is the defense attorney for the state, and he's trying to get this guy to basically be sent to exile. And his entire speech is so moving and so compelling that instead of put up a defense, instead of in any way defend himself, the guy that's on trial willingly goes and goes into exile rather than receive just a minimal punishment simply because he was so embarrassed. And it shows you the level of oratory that Cicero had, and that has become legendary. The next really interesting part about this book is his letter to Mark Antony. And if you know anything about Roman history, I don't know that much, but this is the stuff I know. It's so funny how limited my history knowledge is. It's just based around figures and ideas that I like. But essentially, Mark Antony became the Roman Empire emperor after Julius Caesar was assassinated. And Mark Antony was a great general, but that's where his accolades ended. Cicero wrote, I think it's like 17 pages in the book, and essentially it's just Cicero calling him a gay prostitute who cannot handle his money and pissed away the fortune of the great general Pompey within a few weeks. And when he wrote this, he knew he was writing his death warrant. Later on, the soldiers that Mark Antony tried to, he sent out an order for all these soldiers to take Cicero's head. And essentially, in the end, Cicero says, what you're doing is dishonorable, but do it with honor. And I think that's one of the coolest ways to go out. I think that's one of the coolest last words that I've ever heard. And Cicero was a asshole to the end, right? But the last part is really him giving advice. And I don't think Cicero is a great philosopher. I think he's an interesting philosopher. I think he has interesting things to say. Nietzsche absolutely hated Cicero's philosophy. And I kind of see it as like the very think about like a great professor. Like we have great professors, but their opinions aren't really that well versed outside of their field of study. And that essentially that's what I see Cicero's philosophy as. Essentially, that's how I break it down. But not to say that overall he's not intelligent, not to say that he overall doesn't have interesting ideas. The one idea that sticks with me is if you have the capacity to do good, you have the responsibility to do good for the people in your society. And I think that's one of the most compelling ideas that I've ever read, and I was thoroughly inspired by that. The next thing we have is Letters from a Stoic by Seneca. Seneca, I think, is the best Stoic philosopher. Seneca's a very interesting figure because he's just weird. He really is. He was a advisor to a Roman emperor. Basically got caught up in a plot to assassinate the emperor, was falsely accused, and then was forced to drink poison anyway. Very interesting guy, and he was, in his death, he was unwilling to show any fear. In his death, he was unwilling to show any sort of control, and it's so inspiring to see somebody have that level of courage in the face of imminent doom. I mean, that's really the quintessential Stoic philosopher, if you're asking me. But some of Seneca's interesting ideas are we suffer more in our own mind than we do in reality, meaning that we always build things to be worse than they are and worse than they could ever be in our own heads. And it's something that we need to work through because the things that we are forced to face are never as bad as our fears make them out to be. Think about, you always have a fear of heights or you have a fear of public speaking, but the moment you go on that roller coaster, the moment you start speaking and that presentation goes well, you kind of get past that and it's no longer as daunting as you once thought it to be. Another interesting facet was growing old. Essentially, he saw growing old as the next challenge, the next step. He was successful up to whatever point he was, and then he became old. So now that's the next thing he has to conquer. He conquered all other challenges, and now this is the next thing. And his imminent death makes every single second that he's alive mean that much more. Overall, I just think Seneca has a much more interesting and profound interpretation of Stoicism. But although I think, most people point to Marcus Aurelius as the most influential Stoic philosopher, and that's probably because he's the most widely read. And we're going to get to him at the end of this. It looks like it's the last book, yeah. So we're going to get to Marcus Aurelius at the end. But I think Marcus Aurelius is somewhat limited in the work that we have because Meditations is merely a journal and merely like affirmations of his Stoic philosophy and not meant to be read. Whereas Seneca is like kind of performing for an audience. This book is called Letters from a Stoic, and it's Seneca's letters where he's basically like just flexing on all of his friends and all of his relatives how he has the greatest old man advice of all time, and it's kind of it's more performative, and that's why I enjoy it more. And there's some context to it as well because he's giving people life advice throughout different experiences, throughout different themes, and it overall makes a more cohesive and more interesting work for me. But again, many people like Marcus Aurelius, and many people can sing his praises, and I can see why. The next thing we have is Fragments by Heraclitus. Heraclitus I think he was a contemporary of Pythagoras, the triangle guy. Pythagoras is a very interesting person as well. If you want to study someone interesting, study Pythagoras. He wasn't just a mathematician, he was also a cult leader. There's all sorts of interesting beliefs that he had about shapes and harmonics and, just overall reincarnation and a monad, and there's all sorts of interesting philosophy, and some people say that Pythagoras even had some major influences and was a contemporary of Moses, or maybe was Moses, or maybe was Hermes Trismegistus. There's all these interesting conspiratorial-esque theories about Pythagoras, but overall it's just, he's interesting. But to me, the most interesting part about Heraclitus is that essentially Heraclitus was how do I say this, like a skeptic or somebody that would always question things. He didn't believe in absolutes. You could see a lot of Plato's ideal of forms come from this. Essentially, his most inspiring idea is you never step in the same river twice. When you step in the same river, you're both a different person, and the river is farther downstream. The part of the river that you first contacted with is way downstream, and you're getting a new stream. You're getting a new river. It's changed. The rocks have swept away, and now they're all new rocks. The thing that you're experiencing is something completely new. It might look the same, but it's different. And essentially, it's just the idea of flux, the idea of change, the idea that everything is changing, and the idea of acceptance. Heraclitus has this idea of fire, which is basically, think about it like entropy, like heat transfer. Everything is just constantly changing, constantly decaying, constantly being born and reborn and dying and all sorts of these ideas, and everything is part of a grand big cycle. Unfortunately, I think this is all that remains of Heraclitus' writing, and a lot of this is the introduction and the notes at the end. But it's interesting, a lot of what we know about Heraclitus survives through other writers like Cicero, like Plato. I'm pretty sure, I don't know, I think a lot of the older philosophers mentioned him. I don't want to misquote exactly who mentioned him, but he's a great philosopher. He has a lot to say, a lot of interesting ideas. Well worth your time reading it because it's so short and it's so profound. And if you really want to see the inspiration for Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, just read Fragments by Heraclitus. Next thing we have is the Five Dialogues by Plato. My favorite in particular is Plato's Apology, which is essentially the death and trial of Socrates. To me, I think Plato has a few interesting ideas that are extremely profound, that are extremely long lasting, and yeah, I think he has a lot to say on things, and his style of writing is interesting because he writes in dialogues. It's not like normal philosophy where it's like, well, this happens, then this happens, then this happens. You have to kind of parse what he's trying to say through the dialogue between generally Socrates and the people surrounding him, and the conversation. And, really a lot of what we know about Socrates comes from Plato, because he kind of gives him this personification. And it's interesting to even speculate, like, is Socrates really this great man? Was he really this great individual? Or was it more so Plato kind of talking about his master, talking about his hero in such a positive light that it leaves such a almost heroic-esque figure? But, Plato's someone that's extremely interesting if you get into it, and very profound. I wouldn't say it's like the deepest or the most intellectual philosophy that you'll read. There's a lot of like weird ideas in there as well, but yeah, it's interesting. I really, really, really love Plato's Apology. Well worth it. It's really the first thing that you should read if you are willy-nilly about freedom of speech and how important it is. Essentially what it is Socrates would rather die than live in a world where he can't speak his mind, where he can't question things, where he can't be his own person. And essentially the only thing that he's put on trial for is for questioning, is for making the youth of Athens question, why are we going to war? Why are we doing this? Why are we paying these taxes? Why are we making other people rich while we're making ourselves poor? And for that, he was put to the sword. Actually, he drank poison, but it sounded better in my mind when I said it. The last thing we have is Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. This is probably the simplest work of philosophy that you can read. It has some profound statements in it. It is a good work. I'm not here to bring down Meditations. It's just not my favorite, and that's perfectly okay. I feel like I have a controversial opinion that I don't really like this book that much. Everyone that I've heard talk about it is like, this is the greatest thing ever, and I just think it's probably the only and the first philosophy book that these people have read, because there's so many more interesting ideas, whether it comes to Emerson, whether it comes to Henry David Thoreau, or even Nietzsche, if you can read him properly. But yeah, I just think this book is limited for the thing that I said earlier. It's meant to be his journal. It's not meant to be something that was published, so it doesn't have that performative element to it. It's very raw. It's very broken down. It's very simplistic, and in certain regards, that makes it more compelling in certain ways, because he's not sugarcoating it. He's not dressing it up. But at the same time, I like the artistry. I like the creativeness. I like the poetry. I like the allegory and metaphors. And to me, it's not as exciting. And everything it does well, I think other books do even better. One of the most interesting facets of this is like, this is really where I learned the idea that if we live forever, there'd be no meaning, because if you live forever, then there'd be no urgency to do anything. I know this is something I've talked about a lot on the channel, so like, it's sometimes interesting to see like books that I don't necessarily like that I reference. But yeah, with that said, here are, how many books are these? Books are there? 5 books of Greek and Roman philosophy to get you through the day. That's not gonna be the title of the video, but yeah, just felt like talking about this, especially after I read Julius Caesar. But yeah, love you guys so much. Thank you guys so much. Peace out. I'll catch you in the next one.